Thank you, everybody, for joining in. We're back with another episode of the InterDrone Podcast, your 30,000-foot view of the commercial drone industry. It is Monday, August 3rd. My name is CJ Smith. I'm joined today with Michael Pehel. He is the chairman of InterDrone, and we have two fantastic guests with us today. We're really excited to have them both on. First, Romeo Durscher. He is the Senior Director of Public Safety Integration at DJI. We're also joined with Scott Parazynski. He is a physician, astronaut, tech CEO, recently inducted into the U.S. Astronaut Hall of Fame. He's been in a number of space shuttle missions, and he's stepped foot on the moon himself. So we're really excited to have him on, the first astronaut that we've been able to speak to on this podcast. And of course, these two gentlemen have actually worked together in previous lives over at NASA. So Romeo, we'll start with you. If you wouldn't mind just giving us a very brief introduction about yourself, some of the work you do now at DJI, and kind of how your career took you into drones and where you are today. And then, Scott, I'd love for you to do the same thing.
Yeah, thank you, CJ and Mike, for having us. This is a true honor to be on this podcast with you three gents, especially Scott. It's good to see you again, and what a timely occurrence, with Dragon Endeavour splashdown yesterday, and today we're here talking about so much cool technology. So fantastic timing. As for me, born and raised in Switzerland, hence the accent. I can't get rid of it. I had wanted to work on a space mission. Actually, I wanted to be an astronaut, but when I joined the Swiss military, which is mandatory, I was diagnosed with severe motion sickness. And that immediately made me not eligible to be a military pilot. And that kind of then also discouraged me from continuing on an astronaut track. But I did want to work on a space mission, and that's what ultimately made me move to the US, because Switzerland has a fantastic astronaut that has flown many times, but that's where it almost ends when it comes to space exploration. And so I knew I had to come to the US. Fast forward, I almost spent 13 years working on the NASA Solar Dynamics Observatory. And during that time, exactly 10 years ago, actually, my best friend, Mark Johnson, he said, "Romeo, you got to come to my house and look what I bought." And Mark Johnson has a forensic analysis company, so they recreate accidents from airplane crashes, train derailments, all those kind of things. So aerial imagery was always an important piece. And I went to his house, and there was this weird-looking thing on his coffee table. And it turns out it was one of those early drones. It wasn't a DJI. It was from China, though. No instructions, nothing. And that's what kind of started my interest into these aerial platforms. And I was able to join DJI 6 years ago. So quite a different time 6 years ago versus today. But I immediately realized that drones will have a fundamental impact in public safety and humanitarian missions. And that's where I put my focus on. And today really projects and deployments, but also been involved in a lot of the early lessons learned, especially on the public safety side. And I honestly think the technology has only, peaked a little bit. There's so much more that can be done and will be done. And we're very fortunate to be this early on in all of it.
Great. Scott?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to join you guys. It's great to join my very good friend, Romeo. I have so much respect for all he's done throughout his career, and for him befriending me as a new guy in this industry. It's really been wonderful to have this association with him. And it's great to be part of the broader drone community. So thanks for having me on this podcast. I did want to make one correction, though, CJ. I have not actually set foot on the moon. I've taken 5 space shuttle missions and done some really cool spacewalking outside of the International Space Station and the Russian Space Station Mir, but didn't quite get a chance to set boot prints down on the moon. But what's really exciting about being alive today is that we're going back. And in fact, we're not going to stop at the moon. We're going to be going to Mars and perhaps even places beyond. And so as a technologist, I'm an inventor, product developer. I'm also a physician, as was mentioned. It's a target-rich environment. There's so many problems that we have today that we can actually leverage technology to address. So I'm really bullish about the drone industry. I've been a pilot for many, many years, of course, and an early technology adopter in drones. When they first came out, I was one of the first to get the fledgling DJI drones, and look at how far we've come in just a few short years. And so the reason I guess I'm here on this podcast is I have something to do with drones. I have a company called Fluidity Technologies, and we've developed a really intuitive way to move assets through the sky. So essentially, making the process of flight almost a subconscious act, so that you can really concentrate on what you're doing with your asset, whether it's a camera drone, it's a sensor drone, it's if you're there for cinematography and ISR, there to get situational awareness on a fire or a first-person shooter, the kinds of public safety issues that Romeo is really concerned with. You can really focus on that task rather than the mechanics of how you're going to get there. The ways in which radio-controlled flight first took foot back in the late 1930s, those controllers look very, very similar to the controls that we have today, an Xbox controller with two sticks. And it's not the way the human mind is mapped to our hands. It's not the way we see the world. And so we basically map to the three-dimensional world with one reference frame off of our hand, our thumb, and the way that we move our joystick, such that in a few minutes you can actually be out there doing perfect figure eights, inward-facing ascending spirals, going with precision and with situational awareness exactly where you want to go. And you're looking at your video stream, and you're getting the shot that you want without concern that you're going to crash or have issues. So we've really thought from the ground up how to move assets through physical and virtual space. So our tools are not only powerful for the drone industry, but things further afield, augmented and virtual reality, surgical robotics, helicopter flight, ROVs, industrial cranes. It's a platform for mobility. And so we're really excited about our first generation product, the FT Aviator, but there will be many other things that you're going to see in the years ahead that will knock your socks off.
Great. I think that's really interesting, the point you just made, that traditionally a lot of these controllers shaped like an Xbox controller, it's not exactly how the human mind kind of thinks and is wired. I mean, what was the inspiration for Fluidity Technologies? What problems did you guys see in the market, and what kind of pushed you guys to come out with this piece of hardware?
Well, actually, the genesis of Fluidity is actually further afield from drones than you might think. I was working at a medical research institute here in Houston, Texas, called the Houston Methodist Research Institute, and working in as the CTO at this institute, and started to look at the complexity of surgical robotics. I'm not sure if you've ever seen or heard of a Da Vinci surgical robot, but it's a really amazing piece of technology wherein the surgeon has his or her fingers in these little finger loops, and you're kind of in a wraparound screen. You take off your shoes, and your feet are on different keyboard pegs, and it's a really remarkable way to do very complex surgery remotely. However, unless you're doing it all the time, your proficiency wanes, and the outcomes aren't nearly as good. It's a very difficult skill to learn. And so based on my experience living and working in space, flying jet aircraft, robotic arms, VR simulations, and other assets, I came up with the core technology for our FT Aviator. And so ultimately what I have set out to do is completely rethink surgical robotics. But as you, I'm sure, are aware, the regulatory hurdles to get a surgical robot into the marketplace is incredibly long and expensive. And we saw the exciting drone marketplace is something that's rapidly growing. The regulatory hurdles weren't nearly as onerous. And plus, I just love drones. So that's how we ended up here.
Cool.
When I'm listening to you talk, I think about when we drive cars, the fact that we're stuck with this wheel system because everybody's used to it. But the truth of the matter is there's probably dozens of better controllers for having cars, for actually steering cars.
For manually piloting a car, there would be much better ways to do it. Absolutely.
Yeah. And any insight into that? Maybe that's your next market.
Well, so what's interesting, be interested in you guys' impressions on this as well. I'm also very bullish about, automation, how we, best leverage the human in the loop. Actually, I prefer the term, pilot on the loop, but how do we monitor and get the best out of our drones and even our terrestrial robotic systems? I think we can do more with less. But you always need to have that pilot or driver in loop, I think, in an emergency. Our sensors don't always work as well as we'd like. The world isn't always as we saw it the last time we were here. And so, and then there are times when we want to go off script. We want to divert over here because we saw something interesting. So, that auto sequence that you might have programmed, you want to take a different path. And so, how can we make our tools, the human-machine interfaces, more intuitive so that in a pinch, in an emergency or, with someone who's much less trained, he or she can get in there and do the task or land safely?
Yeah, that's super important. And this has always been kind of the rolling discussion because we're in the automation industry with drones is, there's plenty of people who think that the human pilot right now is the biggest barrier to scaling. That I think is 100% true. But I think there's also sometimes an overemphasis on the human being an issue that needs to be eliminated, where when you really think about what we're good at versus what the machines are good at, even if you're talking about machine learning, it's still a very rule-based system, and those edge cases are what cause the problem. And if we think about like the Tesla that rode into a truck, that had to do with the way we were actually classifying the images. So it was a human decision because ultimately we're going to program these things, machine learning or not, that led to the classification kind of paradigm that led to that car driving into the truck. So, the human has to be able to, like you say, seize control when we do reach an emergency kind of endpoint. And I think that's going to be a story for a lot longer before we reach a totally fully automated system. And there's a lot of developments that have to happen in AI before that would be possible. So trying to figure out, I think, the human part of the equation and how that's going to evolve is going to be what's negotiated between stakeholders in the industry, regulators, and the public at large for the foreseeable future.
Could not agree more. Yeah, very well stated. That Tesla case is a perfect example about that shows the complexity of our world that we can't anticipate.
Right.
I think it's you got to do it in steps. And like Scott mentioned, we started off with this remote controller that has two sticks for 90 years or so. We've been used to that, and it takes time to get away from that paradigm shift of using two hands. If you now can move just over to using one hand and still have another hand available for other tasks. I'll give you a good example. Let's say a swap mission is happening and they're sending in a ground robot. Ground robot gets stuck because, most times there is a lot of stuff on the ground. These robots only get so far or maybe can't go upstairs. So now they're sending in a drone. And they're sending in a drone and the operator is using both his hands to fly the drone in. And there was a case a few years ago where now the entry team goes in. Everybody's inside the house. The drone operator is the only person flying out there with the drone. And the bad guys jumps out of the window, runs around the house, and runs in front of the drone operator, who's tied up with both of his hands.
Right.
So he couldn't do anything to stop the guy. But worse, had the guy decided to, pull a weapon, He couldn't have done anything.
He's vulnerable.
We're tied up. And so what Scott is trying to achieve is a tremendously big step. A, moving away from that traditional sense of flying, and B, allowing the operator to have another hand available for another task if need be. And I think that's a huge step forward in that progression of autonomous flight.
Thank you, Romeo. And one thing I wanted to amplify on what you just said there is, for people that are in harm's way, like your colleagues in public safety, and also our military, they really want to keep their dominant hand on their firearm. They need it. I mean, it's their protection. So our control system is intuitive enough, simple enough that you can actually fly with your non-dominant hand. And so for say a Navy SEAL or someone who's really going into harm's way, they would have those kinds of freedoms. So
cool. And back to your controller, Scott. Your controller works with DJI drones, correct?
It does. It works with the vast majority of them. The DJI has just released a couple of exciting new drones, and so we're in the process of coding for those in the new SDKs. But and very soon we'll have the ability to fly with Parrot and many other brands of drones as well, to include Pixhawk.
Okay. Yeah. Speaking of new drones, I mean, Romeo, I know the Matrice 300 was announced maybe a month or two ago. Very influential for our audience of commercial drone pilots. I mean, what can you say about kind of the Matrice 300? I don't know if you have insight into some of the thought process at DJI and kind of some of the markets they're really aiming at integrating with this.
Yes, that's a good question. Yeah, this is an interesting platform, and we worked fairly closely with the R&D team. There were other features I wanted to really see in this platform. Unfortunately, you always think very, very big, and then you kind of meet reality and you come up with something that may not be as big as you initially wanted it to be, but still is a leap forward. And I think one of the things we're seeing is that the payloads, obviously the data is, what you need. And in order to get the data, you need payloads, you need sensors. And we're seeing when we released the XT2, the visual and thermal sensor both in one package. For the first time, we saw this dual combo, and we've built upon that. So now with the M300, we can have up to 4 sensors in one payload. So we have a wide angle camera, we have a zoom camera, we have a laser rangefinder, and we have a thermal camera, all in one. And that gives you tremendously helpful data points that you now can use to make your decision. And that was really the big focus, that we are adding additional components to it so that when you do a mission, you get more information that can allow you to make a decision based upon what you're seeing, what you're reading. And that's definitely the M300. We also did a lot of configuration internally on it to make it more compact, also a little bit more secure to weather environments, and added components to it like the health management system, very much in line with what we're seeing in the airline industry or in the crewed aviation. Better data of what is happening inside the platform. What are the error codes? What do the error codes mean? When is it time for maintenance? And what should the maintenance look like? Information like that to much more mimic the standards that come from the crewed aviation side. And I think overall, it's a big step forward. Now, I always like to go back to when we released the Mavic 2 Enterprise, the small little platform, and we added 3 attachments to it back then, a beacon light, a spotlight, and a speaker. And it was very fascinating to see the community react, the drone community react to that. And a lot of the comments were, well, DJI is running out of ideas. Now they're putting a speaker on a drone. And it was very fascinating because at the time, people didn't realize the power of a simple speaker or a simple spotlight on a drone. And so Today, when we released a laser rangefinder, there was barely anyone that said, DJI is running out of ideas, because who needs a laser rangefinder? So I think in the future, we will see more of these sensors that are integrated and provide real-time data points that may let us do just better and faster decisions.
It seems like every drone company is pushing towards airframes that can actually service specific commercial verticals. And the Matrice seems like a beast. The 300 does. What's one of the more interesting kind of commercial industrial use cases that you think that this airframe will be used in?
Obviously, public safety is the biggest vertical in the United States right now. But the Matrice was also built with utilities in mind, inspection of power lines, for example. Here in the United States, and it's so interesting because we had this discussion just over the weekend, we have the majority of our power lines are above ground. And they are on these, most of these wooden posts that, especially during a wildfire, don't stand up very long. But also on the East Coast, during the harsh winter times, those exposed cables to the elements and ice tend to break, and you have all these power outage issues. So with this aging infrastructure, I call it, we also need more inspection. And the way inspection is done today by helicopter is not only extremely expensive, but also dangerous. Mm-hmm. And if we can provide technologies that allow for a simplified process that's also a cost-saving process, we're making a huge impact on the utility side. And I think that's where the M300 really also comes in to shine. It's not just the public safety sector, but really oil, gas, utilities, and utilize those additional data points and high definition cameras and autonomous features. One of my favorite features that's also helping on the public safety side is just outlining an area, and it will take a series of close-up images and an overview image, so you always see which zoomed in picture is where. So you have the data set immediately by only doing a little draw box. Making the task simpler, that's another big component in enhancing the usability of the drone technology.
That's so interesting because we're getting into UI then. We're really thinking in terms of how are we getting the right data to the user in the format that they feel comfortable with, where they could actually make an insightful decision. So, I think it's easy to underestimate progress like that.
Yeah,
those are really like the harder things to solve, right? Compared to where we were years ago, I think.
Yes, and it's so funny because when we released the Inspire 1 in November 2014, it was the most sexiest of drones. And to this day, I would say it's probably the coolest drone that has ever come to market.
It's the last one that really got like the awe-inspiring, like how does it do all of that compared to what we were able to do like a day before it was released, And
they also set us up in a way to compare only the hardware pieces. Does it look cool? Does it look, modernized? When really a lot of the enhancements, like you mentioned, Mike, are now inside. Insight either in form of additional components that we don't see, or then how we interact with that drone, either through a joystick like Scott's Fluidity, or a simplified UI that makes your task and job just so much simpler. But those are hard to see because they're not those shiny, cool, objects that move around and raise your landing gear and all that cool stuff.
True. Yeah, but on the other side, those things are the things the users don't see, or maybe the broader commercial market doesn't see, or maybe even consumers don't care about or won't make headlines. But there's a difference between an enterprise purchase and not.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Romeo, what else is top of mind for DJI right now? Kind of how has DJI been impacted with the coronavirus pandemic, and what steps or measures are they taking to kind of minimize some of the risks and to move forward, and especially as we move in the second half of 2020 and into early 21?
Yes, I mean, obviously, we're dealing with something that most of us have never, had to deal with on such a scale, and it's impacting pretty much everyone these days. Mm-hmm. It has also impacted DJI. We adjusted pretty quickly internally, but also on our side, we very quickly moved into our disaster relief program activation for COVID-19 in mid-March, when we started to see that the United States will be impacted more by this virus. So we made additional units available to get out into the public safety realm with two big reasons. Number one, we wanted to not only support those entities, but also the communities. But number two, we did it in a way of pay it forward. You learn and you share your learning so that everyone can benefit from it, because not every department has the resources and manpowers to test things and do lessons learned. So we were able to support 45 departments across 22 states, and we really learned a lot of lessons on how are drones being utilized on a public safety side during a response like we're seeing right now. Some of those use cases were very fascinating, like Wyckoff Police in New Jersey. They used the drone with the speaker for community building. They would go to kids' home and fly the drone in the front yard, singing happy birthday through the speaker.
That's cute.
Had been in homes for weeks. And to me, that is a fantastic use case, because it does so many things that we never thought, would happen. But then we also saw other departments that built drop mechanisms with regular home items or office items so that they could deliver medicines or masks or gloves to people that were in quarantine so that they could keep social distance. So really interesting things that came out of it. And obviously one of the biggest lessons learned also is you got to think through your deployment before you do deployment, because your community reacts to new technology, and there's only three ways they react. Either they love it, they don't have an opinion, or they don't like it. And as with everything else, the people that don't like it, their voices are magnified by media, because that kind of makes it a much better story than, the happy birthday singing song story. And so you got to think that through before you deploy. And that's an important component of not only humanitarian deployments, but also public safety deployments.
I think this is really, if there's a silver lining in the COVID pandemic, it's that it's accelerating certain areas of technology. And I think certainly it's taking place in robotics writ large, drones in particular, and the deliveries that you're talking about, Romeo. Certainly that's a great example of it. But think about how quickly telemedicine is advanced in the last. You can't see a doctor, unless you're on your deathbed almost. You've got to see them first via telemedicine. So in the past, that was kind of a step too far. You've got to come in and see me, and you've got to pay me to render an opinion. Now they're going to do everything they can to see you from afar. Right. And so we're using automation and robotic systems in novel ways. And I think it's actually going to be an incredible catalyst in many ways.
Yeah, there's another component to what you just said, Scott, which is that the regulators kind of took a little bit of the grip off on the HIPAA interpretation, not the requirements. The requirements were actually able to be met by other technologies, but those other technologies never would have gotten seen under normal circumstances. And it's interesting how crisis can drive innovation like that.
Yeah, the easiest answer for a regulator is to say no. To take the most conservative approach and to say no. But in times of need, of course, you can do things and you can do them safely.
I want to go back to Romeo's kind of point on transparency, because he didn't use that word specifically, but that seems to be one of the most underappreciated aspects of launching a successful public safety drone program. You could probably scale your program if your use cases are always saving lives, specifically in search and rescue, without kind of much public interference. But when it comes to law enforcement, police officers specifically, there's a lot more public interest in making sure that those drones are operating with their personal interests in mind. So what have you kind of seen out there as far as experiences of people doing it the right way to make sure the public is informed about how your drones are being operated by law enforcement?
Yes, and that's a very, very important point. And I've been stressing that for many years, that you've got to be transparent, especially here in the United States, because we have a very different relationship with law enforcement, which has been highlighted over the last several weeks.
Sure.
If a firefighter flies a drone, the public applauds and is happy. If a police officer flies a drone, the public is unhappy. And that's very, very important to understand. A very good example is Marin County Sheriff's Office. Marin County is on the other side, on the north side of the Golden Gate. And they have a very successful drone program that is being requested by a lot of agencies around their county. And once a quarter, they release a document with all of the missions that they have flown and the outcome. And to me, that is a fantastic piece of transparency, because it not only shows what was done, where was it done, but what was the outcome of it. And some of the outcomes were, well, we helped find the missing person, but some of the outcomes were, well, we helped arrest people, we seized drugs and weapons. And you've got to see that piece as well. You don't just have to, if you see, the police is flying these drones because of A, B, and C, that's okay. But what comes out of it? That's also an important component to show. We see departments that use social media to update the community that, hey, we're about to fly here because we have a wildfire or because we have a traffic incident and we need to do the mapping. And so by doing that, you are much more transparent. Now, obviously, with transparency also comes the risk that more people want to inquire about, your program, because now they know about it. If you don't talk about it, then nobody knows about it unless they see you flying. So you just have to be ready to also answer questions, and I think that's really in some areas not done as well as in others. But the transparency factor absolutely is one of the most important pieces, not only for your community, but also for your city council and county councils and mayors and elected officials, that they also can get behind the use of this technology. But it all boils down to, in essence, one thing. The drone really is not a new concept. We've flown helicopters and airplanes for decades over cities, over incidents, oftentimes with highly sophisticated camera technology equipment on the belly of it, with speakers, with everything that a drone is doing. But the drone, just because it's much smaller, because it's much more nimble, just evokes a little bit more of a concern in some people.
Sure.
So I want to interject a question that isn't planned here, just based on what you're saying. And we've had conversations recently on the podcast about this. I think Patrick Sherman made a good point that, what's the difference between a drone and a camera on a really long pole? And then you compare that to the amount of cameras that we have on city blocks monitoring people, older use cases like the helicopter. And it's interesting that drones just get appraised differently because they intersect at a lot of those technologies. And then, there's the other thing, because they're new, they're easier to attack. So you can have people that are running for office that will use that fear to make it seem like they solved the problem. when, all these other data security issues for the individual are still there, available and at large. I had a question, but there's a lot of noise in the background that kind of distracted me. But I think the question is, data security with DJI is top of mind for a lot of people. And, I pointed out some what I think are faults in the country of origin principle, but maybe just talk about security in general. What is DJI doing to make drones secure, the data that is transferred by them secure?
Look, data security is an extremely important topic overall. And that's not just on the drone side, but in general, data security is extremely important. And, it's interesting because we do kind of have a mark on our back because DJI is a Chinese headquarters company. And we have come out of the consumer space. And we were really the first big drone company that was globally, successful. Obviously, in the beginning, certain things we didn't take fully into consideration. Over the last years, we've really learned a lot about data security, what it means to provide proper data security to especially enterprise customers. That's the key component because it's a very different environment if I'm a hobby photographer and I'm out flying and taking a beautiful picture versus if I'm doing a public safety mission, if I'm doing critical infrastructure, I want to feel that I have control over the data. And that's what we've provided to these entities. But reality is that we really got to have a proper data standard in the drone industry. And there's a couple of projects that are working on that. And I think that will help not only DJI, but that will help every drone manufacturer so that we can really build towards a standard and provide a standard solution to end users. And I think that's what's gonna help. The origin ban, it's a silly notion because it will have such a negative impact on so many other areas that it just doesn't make sense to even continue that thought process. But what we really need to focus on is on these standards and make them available and then let manufacturers build towards those standards.
Right.
Yeah, if you focus on actually closing the security holes and vulnerabilities, that's not to say that DJI is the right product for you. Maybe your assessment at an enterprise level or at a government level for whatever you're doing says, I can't secure the data enough, or I don't feel comfortable with my options here. But you got to look at it from there because the country of origin issue, it runs up against capitalism itself. There's only so many places you could get parts at such a cheap level. And, the market forces are driving that down. So if we even want to have that functionality available for the drones we fly within the United States, we have to make those considerations. Intel, for example, moved their chip manufacturing out of the United States. And that's, I think this was a recent article. So that means that's one of the last big ones that would even be able to produce at scale here. That's a very, very different equation. So, security is a personal responsibility. And I think, if the more that DJI does on that front for providing those options, the better you guys are going to do to get out of kind of the target crosshairs here.
Absolutely. It's, and you're right with that. For example, we make technology for peaceful purposes. We don't actively sell into defense. If any defense entity wants to use DJI, well, there are options. But that's not where we are focusing on. And it's interesting that we get hammered for a U.S. Army memo that says, DJI is not secure from a few years ago when that's not even our target area. We don't do technology for military purpose. We do it for peaceful purpose, to help. So it's a very fascinating environment, and it was definitely an amazing learning experience too, because again, what you cannot predict, you cannot prevent.
Right, and who would have predicted that? I don't think any of us on the consumer commercial side would have, especially in the early days.
Right. Scott, I want to bring this back to you. I mean, you bring a really just unique perspective to the drone industry as a whole. Kind of at a high level, what are some of your thoughts on where we are now as an industry? I mean, what really excites you? What, if anything, concerns you? And what do you think, if anything, is holding the industry back right now?
Well, I think we're still in a really nascent phase. I think the regulatory environment still hasn't figured out where it wants to be, where it needs to be. Mm-hmm. I'm really excited about opening up the airspace, not just to UAS, but to eVTOL aircraft. Mm-hmm. And there's no reason why this is before you guys, but the Jetsons, having your own, personal, aircraft that it's easy to fly, that can get you from point A to point B, right. Beyond the traffic, to get air ambulances to a patient in 60 seconds as opposed to 45 minutes, depending on what kind of congested environment you live in. I mean, I think there are a lot of opportunities to really expand the use of our airspace safely, and we're just developing the technologies and the regulatory framework to get there. So I do think that there's a lot we can do to fly with greater situational awareness of one another. I think there are huge barriers, I think, to flying in a inner city, for example. All the steps that you have to take, whether you use AirMap or whatever app you use to get your clearance, and then to actually get it transferred to your drone, and then to launch and fly your mission. I think streamlining that is going to be really important, and then also communicating with other pilots and other assets in the area, the life flight and the police helicopters and then the air traffic and the higher airspace, just for us to be able to communicate in a seamless way. We can do this safely. I think we need to be able to fly beyond visual line of sight, and to use the grid effectively to do that. And once we do that, I think we actually will be able to fulfill the promise of deliveries and especially in a pandemic or post-pandemic world, do certain tasks remotely quite safely. So I'm excited about the furtherance of automation and also the leveraging of human-machine interfaces like ours to really be a monitor, a pilot on the loop, being able to manage a swarm of assets, but on occasion you need to dive in and operate one or more of them. You can do that in a seamless way, having probably mission control sort of environment where an environment like where Romeo concerns himself in an active fire, to be able to deploy assets around and decide where to fight the fire next, how to get people out of harm's way. There are a lot of exciting things we can do with automation and machine learning to make these tools incredibly powerful. So again, just to summarize, I think we're still pretty early in the game, and there are a lot of smart people around the world trying to make it happen.
Right. Yeah, I think just this industry is so global, which is really exciting. You see people from different countries learning from each other. You even see companies sometimes integrate into a different country because the regulations may be more permitting over there, so they're able to roll out their technology there. And I think that's all really exciting, and just creates more and more innovation. What's top of mind for Fluidity as we move into the second half of this year, 2021? You mentioned you're almost doubling, I think, your headcount, which is really exciting. Any company that's hiring right now, I think, is tremendously exciting. Yeah. So congratulations for that. But what can you tell us about what's next?
We are really excited. Yeah. So we had been using outsourced engineering up until this point, but we're actually bringing on a really exciting, capable engineering team. So, in fact, if any superstar coders, electrical or mechanical engineers, reach out to us if you want to reinvent the future. But we are growing rapidly, and we see ourselves as a platform for mobility. So we probably will. You're going to start seeing us in fields other than drones in the future. We obviously continue to be incredibly excited about this industry, and we'll always be there. But our tools for controlling an asset precisely in a three-dimensional world applies to a lot of different areas, as I mentioned. So you can expect to, like the Xbox controller. It's kind of interesting. The radio-controlled systems that we've been talking about here. It's something that we grew up with, and you can develop a great skill with them and muscle memory. And so it's interesting. There are companies that actually develop controllers for the military, and what they've done is actually mirrored them off of an Xbox controller. So you'll see twin thumbstick controllers to, control a Patriot missile or some asset on a tank. So we see ourselves as a platform that will help us help our customers drive computer-aided design, CAD designs on a computer screen, be able to work through a virtual reality environment, maybe to move industrial scissor lifts, aerial refueling, all sorts of different things where our controller could be the new platform.
I got one more question for Scott, and then I kind of want to open it up for Romeo and Scott to ask each other some questions about where things are. So, I mean, I'm super impressed that anybody that engages in hardware. I said this before we kind of got on the tape. What does that journey look like? To say, I'm going to go into hardware as a startup, because there's so many more complications.
Hardware is hard.
Yeah, hardware is hard. But do you start with a prototype, like tinkering in your garage, or do you start with a concept? What was your specific journey, and what were some unexpected kind of speed bumps on that journey to getting an actual product in your hand?
You're too kind. I think hardware is impossible. But I can't help it. I wake up in the morning and I invent things. I trip over myself, trip over ideas, walking down the street. I identify unmet needs, and being a builder, a tinkerer, I cogitate upon it. I go in my workshop, I build a prototype, and iterate upon it. And the things that really kind of levitate to the top, I've tried to commercialize, and so I've had some success there. I have some scars as well. It's not an easy path, as you pointed out, but I think if the significant unmet need is there, and the customers are there, and it's going to change lives, it's worth fighting for. And it's a long, arduous path that it takes twice as long and costs twice as much as you'd ever be able to predict when you jump into it. But it's worth it in the long haul. And so our journey with Fluidity, as I mentioned, is something that I think can save many, many lives. If we can help first responders do their job, if we can help surgeons teleoperate, from the United States and help treat someone in sub-Saharan Africa, then that's a mission that's larger than life. It's worth some battle scars, and so I'm not deterred. It takes a lot of resilience, but I'm very fortunate to have great people around me, and I've had a strong investor network behind me as well that have stood with us, and so that's kind of my story.
How I was going to say how.
Yeah, what was that?
How was your career and your experience as an astronaut helped you as an entrepreneur or a dronepreneur, as we sometimes call it?
Well, poor risk assessment is probably number one.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it. Well, I think being tenacious is an essential attribute for any entrepreneur, and to become an astronaut, it's not a linear path. It's likely that it's going to take quite a while, and you may not get to your destination, but as long as you keep fighting, you're going to make progress. And so I think my pathway through life has prepared me for the rigors of being a tech startup CEO. But also I think the working with teams as we did, addressing really daunting technological challenges, as we did in the space program, really set me up to manage the challenges of drone flight control that we're doing here at Fluidity. I think my experiences doing essentially hardware development and procedure development over my 17 years at NASA was really kind of a natural segue into what I'm doing now.
You're probably actually better at risk assessment than the average startup CEO is.
Yeah, well, the game is all about risk management, and it certainly is something that you have to weigh very carefully.
So I want to tell a story, a quick one to kind of frame up the rest of the podcast. So in 2016, I was still the marketing manager on InterDrone, and it was a big deal, to even get within a circle of Romeo. So I found him at the back of, he was hiding from people at the back of
avoiding
the theater after it had closed, and he was doing his tweets. And I introduced myself, and I was like super fanboy excited to meet him finally. And the reason I bring this up is because years later, last year at UVSI's Exponential, I met him in the hall, and we were talking or whatever, and I saw the same fanboy excitement when he was saying, "Have you met Scott yet?" So I just wanted to, how did you guys? Your careers have intersected twice now. What type of camaraderie does that bring? And maybe kind of just chat casually about your mutual accomplishments together.
Well, I think, Scott is a very, very modest person. If you look at what he has accomplished, not only, 5 space flights, but one of the space flights with late Senator John Glenn. Mm-hmm. That by itself was an amazing mission. STS-120, his last flight, being at the very end of Canadarm, like the furthest away from the shuttle you can be attached, or to the space station you can be attached to the station, working on a solar panel repair, just that by itself. And then, maybe he hasn't set foot on the moon, but Scott has taken a piece of the moon up to Mount Everest. So I don't know if Scott's risk assessment baseline is appropriate for business, but he absolutely is an individual that I have always admired. And I remember the first time I met Scott. I don't know if he remembers that, but it was at an education and public outreach.
I do remember.
Do you?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
It was the AIA Education Alley, and I think it was in San Diego that year. And I was super excited to finally meet, Scott in person. When I saw him transitioning into the drone space, to me that was like super exciting, because I had somebody, NASA, you always say NASA family, and there is some truth to it, that if you've been part of this organization and part of doing something that really changes the way we understand not only Earth, but our surrounding, our universe, that kind of bonds you together. And it felt really nice to have now somebody from that world in this crazy drone world, because it is, especially 2016, 2017, 18. Those were crazy times, and nobody really knew, where all of this was going to. And for somebody to just come in and pick up hardware as the entry, that was super exciting. And so I have appreciated Scott being part of this industry with his knowledge, but also because I am a big fan of what he has accomplished and what he stands for. And so, every little event or big event like CES, every time I walk by the booth and we just like glance at each other and there's a smile, those are precious events and moments that, I now even more so cherish because I've been stuck at home for so long.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's so true.
Well, thank you for those such kind words, Romeo. The feeling is mutual. I have so much admiration for what you do. You've chosen a mission that's larger than life. You're trying to reinvigorate public safety, and you're such a great advocate, and you're out there championing the latest and greatest saves, and it's really changing the face of this industry, and making it my passion. I don't want to talk too much. I'm not here to promote my company, but my firm belief is that every squad car, every fire rig in the world, in fact, ought to have a drone on board. And that would be simple to use. And before you send a human being into harm's way, make sure that you know where you're going and what you're going to do once you get there. And that's my friend Romeo's mission in life. And he's going to succeed in it. He's making great strides. I think it's going to, like a hardware business, it's going to take longer than either of us expected to actually get to the finish line. But it's a wonderful thing. And so he's devoted himself first as a scientist. That's where we met through SOHO, through the Solar Observatory, that he was out, kind of inspiring young people through. What was the name of that? Your mascot that I have? There's a picture we can dig up someplace of me holding the mascot.
Camilla SDO.
There we go, Camilla SDO. That's right. Yeah. So that was on my Twitter or something for the longest time. But you guys did such a great outreach for that. And what's wonderful about Romeo is he's such an engaging, positive voice for the platforms that he's working on, and so he was a great ambassador for that program for young people as well, and now he's moved on to the drone industry, and so it gave me some courage when I decided, hey, I think I'd like to do something in drones. It was great to have his counsel as we set foot in the space as well.
Thank you, Scott. It's been quite a ride, and I, the fanboy that makes me laugh because
why?
it's so funny to hear that, but it has happened a couple of times where people are like so starstruck, and that's the one thing I try not to be. I try to be so engaging and accessible, and help answer questions and have discussions that when people say, oh, fanboy, I always smile about that because it's just a passion in all of us. I mean, what Scott is doing, what you, Mike, and CJ, what you got, we are doing this because of passion. We could do other things, but the passion keeps us here. The passion strives us to do better, to get more done. And sometimes, it's also very frustrating because passion is also something that it starts eating inside you if things don't go the way you want it to go. And then you need to take a little bit of a break to reassess. But that's, in my opinion, people who are passionate about what they're doing, those are the ones that will achieve things that are beyond what is expected or what you think is possible.
Well, it's interesting because I worked on a lot of tech shows, as you know, at BZ Media, less so now at Emerald. But, the drone industry is so unique in the sense that it gives me, in that I actually feel like the people I'm working with and facilitating by having the show are actually making strides for humanity, period. Like, these are fundamentally paradigm shifting technologies. Also, as we learn to use them, we're shifting behavior, we're changing the way we get information, and we're improving and optimizing things to a level that's actually going to improve the welfare of a lot of people. And, as much as Silicon Valley and tech talks that way, it's actually very rare that that's what happens, So this technology fundamentally is different for me. And I think that's also why the frustration that you're speaking of about, I think that's starting to reach its peak, and hopefully we're going to get past the peak of that soon, because, there's unmet expectations. We think it could do more. It's actually worse when we know it can do more. Right. So I think one of the things is that the passionate people fail to underestimate what it takes to get the rest of the humans on board. And that's where we're at. We're at the point where we've created great and amazing technologies that us and the community have started talking to each other and collaborating probably more in the last 2 years than we did in the previous 3, which is great to see.
We'll talk to everybody next week.
And I think COVID will accelerate that. But the next step is getting the rest of everybody else on board and showing them at their level, answering their questions and needs, not our pain points, theirs. I think that's going to be the next evolution of the industry.
It's a marathon, not a sprint. It's certainly going to take longer, but we have to keep our resolve. Romeo said it very well. We're passionate about what we're doing because we can see that future. And I tell young people all the time when I speak to them, that you've got to pursue things that you're most passionate about. If you do, ultimately you'll be successful at it. So I think collectively we're going to be successful.
Agreed. And I think back to the marathon, not a sprint point. I mean, I think a marathon means that the industry will also last longer. It'll take us longer to get there, but it'll be a sustainable space once we do get there. So just really exciting to have professionals like yourselves working in the industry. And a little bit of a silver lining to the pandemic is I think we all agree that it is kind of catalyzing some innovation and some progression in the space. So we really appreciate you guys both being here again. Any final thoughts? And then how can people get in touch if they want to learn a little bit more about what you guys are doing and maybe reach out with follow-up questions? And Scott, why don't we start with you?
I was going to see if Romeo had something brilliant to say while I thought of something brilliant to say. First off, I just wanted to thank you all for inviting me to join you here today. It's been a fun conversation. It's always great to see Romeo, and thank you for allowing us to showcase Fluidity. We have a lot of really exciting things in store for the future. Let's see, in terms of following up, our website is fluidity.tech. And then, Twitter and Instagram, I'm just known as Astrodoc Scott.
Great.
I'll leave it at that.
We'll put those links in the description.
Cool.
Yeah, you summarized it well, Scott. Mike and DJ, it's great to be on the podcast. This is important right now. I do think people sometimes get a little bit podcasted and webinared out. I know I did, especially in April and May. I was on 19 podcasts during those 2 times. They're a tool to help spread, some information, but also stimulate the conversation. The conversation needs to keep going. This is not just the end of this podcast. This is the beginning of more conversations. And I really thank InterDrone for putting a lot of focus on having those conversations. It is extremely important. And that's why we are here today, not only on the podcast, but as a community. We're not here to be rich. Hopefully, eventually, we may get to that point. That would be lovely. But we're here because we have a vision. We see the future. We see something different in the future. And it's not about DJI or Skydio or Autel. It's about all of us. And it's good to see that we are now also seeing competition on the enterprise side. That means we will hopefully progress in enhancement of hardware and software and integration more and more. And with solutions like Fluidity, we're changing the way we're integrating this technology. So I think step by step, we're getting there. And yeah, it may not be as fast as we want, but it is happening. And if people do want to contribute to the discussions or have questions, best way to reach me is on Twitter. It's Romeo CH, and CH stands for Confederazione Helvetica, Switzerland. So it's very easy to remember. Twitter like Scott, but Romeo CH. Best way to get a hold of me, and I always try to be available for questions or make introductions. I think that's such an important piece that sometimes gets missed. Introduce each other and share what we know.
Great. And Romeo, I think I might steal that line. That's the end of this podcast episode, but the start of a new conversation. So that's great. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Thank you to our guests. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Romeo. This episode will be on YouTube. It'll be on the InterDrone Launchpad, Apple Music, Spotify, wherever pods are casted. So thank you all again, and we will see everybody next week.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.